This issue of government-private business, it's very murky over there. Right? Most of the people that are actually doing really well in various industries are either of the government, have been of the government, or are very closely related to the government. You really do need to do some due diligence to find out who you're actually working with. Yeah? Once again, you've got to ask heaps and heaps of questions to find out. Now, this is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a characteristic. But it's really important to find out so that you know what you're doing when you're operating in this market. Now, because of that, the attitude towards government officials is very different to what we have here. For 90% of decisions within the Chinese context, you need to have government approval, all right? And so officials become very, very important people. And this is why they get enmeshed in the business environment, right? Here, it's not as close and there's this separation, but they don't realise that. So when they come over here, they're expecting, even if they've been told that it's not the case, they're expecting some sort of power held by government officials that is much higher than what we actually attribute to them here, all right? Now, of course, that can be useful. Right? If you can show that you actually have close contacts with a few government officials, bring them along to some of the banquets, whatever it may be, then that will give you a lot of status within their eyes, yeah? Even though it may be meaningless over here. One of the things I liked about the place when I first got there was this attitude of optimism. It reminded me back in the 60s in Australia where everyone was kind of happy and smiling and busy and looking, you know. There is this view that things can be done, that things are improving, right? Now, it's not universal, obviously. If you're a poor peasant in the back blocks who's just had your land taken off you, then you're not quite so happy. But for those that are actually out there, there's a really high degree of optimism that we've seemed to have lost in the West. And it's nice to sort of operate within that environment. One of the things you'll find is there's not a culture of maintenance to buildings and equipment, etc. Now, I'm not really sure why. I suspect it's to do with their history because there's been so much turmoil in China's history in the last couple of hundred years that spending a lot of time and money and effort on maintaining a major asset is probably worthless because you may not have it in 10 years' time. And their ability to build new buildings at a much cheaper price than here and so quickly makes it a little bit of a question mark. But when you get over there, you'll find that this is an issue. And of course, if you're doing business and have factories or facilities, then you'll find that this is an issue as well, because you may think we should be putting money into it, and they'll be going, why? This one here is a really important one. Position of power in the relationship. And I've got the Alcan example there. Within much of coastal China, there's these major economic zones, these free trade zones, they used to be. One of them is in between Tianjin and the coast in the Bohai region, and Tianjin Economic Development Authority, or area, and there's really about half a dozen there now, it's growing so fast. But I went and had a look there a couple of years back, and I spent 7 weeks in Tianjin a few years back and got to know these guys from Alcan pretty well, because we're on the same level in the hotel there, the permanents. But it was amazing talking about their entry strategy into China. Yeah? When Alcan went into China, they were looking at building 2 lines, and what they were manufacturing was aluminium wires for the buildings. And they don't use copper, the aluminium's much cheaper. And what they do is they put grooves in the walls, and it's plug and play. You just clip these things in, no need for electricians. Yeah? And they were making, the idea is they're going to make millions and millions of these things for all these new high-rise buildings that were going in. Now, of course, the trouble is Chinalco, China Aluminium, is a huge conglomerate within China itself. So they had a massive competitor. And you'd be thinking, well, why would you want a foreigner to come in? But they let them in, this, that and the other. They went to this Teeter Economic Zone and they set up their factory. And the factory itself was really well built because the Chinese are really good at building things these days. But when they looked at the connecting the power, they promised they thought they were promised a connection from the road into the factory itself. Turned out that wasn't part of the deal. Right? On top of that, they found that it had to be stepped down. The power actually was too high, had to go through a transformer. So they had to actually pay for a transformer as well to be put in between the two on the property. On top of that, local regulations were that for a transformer of this particular size, you needed someone there 24/7 in case something went wrong, caught fire, whatever it was, right? So they had these additional expenses that weren't part of the deal when they finally originally signed off on it, right? And it meant that they could only put in one line instead of 2 lines of production until they got up and running, started making some money, and then they were going to put the second line in, right? Now, you contrast that to Airbus, which is across the road from Alcan. In Tianjin, or in this particular facility, there is a particular mid-sized jet, Airbus jet, that's assembled there in China, right? And with these guys, they said to the Chinese government, local government there, which is very strong, not like local government here, right? They said, here's the plans of our facility in Berlin, right? Our Airbus factory. You build it exactly to those specifications and put it up, and we will come in, right? Which they did. China's got there, and I've been there, had a look. It's unbelievable. It's spick and span, and is an exact copy, absolute replica of the one back in Germany, right? And the idea, of course, is that the Europeans import all the various components, and it's assembled in China. The only stuff that's really locally made in China is the seats and coverings and a whole range of sort of minor details. And of course, the assembly of these planes is much lower. Even though it's exactly the same facility as the one back in Germany, it was only about a third of the assembly rate of back home. But the point about it was, in the first case, the Alcan did not have the position of power, right? So they were sort of let in, if you like, but there was obvious competition already sitting there for them, and the Chinese didn't need them, but they said, okay, you can come in. And so to put in a few obstacles in the way, or not actually give the full story, wasn't a problem, all right? In the second case, for Airbus, Chinese were desperate to have foreign manufacturing facilities on shore so they can learn about it, yeah? The Boeing, Boeing, as you know, is not allowed in there. The Americans won't let them come in there. They've only just recently, in the same area, got a fuselage manufacturing facility there, but all that is carbon fibre, nothing else. Okay. Because this was actually part of the 5-year plan to actually get into the aeronautical industry, they actually pull out all stops. Now, from the position of Airbus, this is a fantastic entry strategy because they have no outlays at all. All they do is lease them. If it's not built 100% to their specifications, they can actually cut the lease and go. They've lost nothing. Yeah. So there's no capital outlay at all involved. Whereas poor old Alcan was stuck. Basically, they weren't happy, but they couldn't, after having sunk all those costs, get out of the deal. My point about all this, anyway, is simply be aware of who has the position of power in the relationship. Yeah? And you need to protect yourself if it's not you. If you have it, then it's up to you how you deal with it. But it is a real key point in all dealings with the Chinese. It's the first thing they think of. Okay, we need to move on. Mandarin, most widely spoken language in the world. Everyone knows that. But you need to be aware, I guess, that it's not the only language. You know, it's in fact, China, until Qin came along a couple of thousand years ago, didn't have one unified written script. He was the guy that said, okay, so at least we can write to each other. Mandarin's a relatively modern, recent addition, and most people over there have their own dialects, which are indecipherable. You know, in many cases, you know, some from the north using their dialect from and speaking to someone from the south can't understand each other. They have to revert to Mandarin. It's very useful to learn basic pinyin. Okay, so for instance, qi equals qi, right? Qi is qi. The X's, the Z's, all that stuff, they're pronounced differently to what we're used to. If you get this stuff down, you can actually at least have close, you won't have perfect, or certainly I don't anyway, but close pronunciations of places and names. And that goes down well. They understand you more. You know, oh, you mean this place. Interpreter, use one or not. Grab one of theirs or grab one of yours, all right? We have an interpreter here. Leonie's over there. I'd recommend Leonie, actually. She's actually quite good. But be careful. Be careful, yeah? We had a Canadian experience where they've gone over one of the townships inland from Shanghai. They were allocated an interpreter and they were doing all the negotiations and talking and looking. And it turned out the interpreter was a high government official. All right? I would strongly recommend you get your own interpreter. All right? And even when people are coming over here, you get your own interpreter. And even if they don't know that the person who's your interpreter can speak Chinese, that's actually very useful. We at Flinders Uni, we had a case where there was a lot of things being said in one of our joint ventures that were very surprising to us and changed the relationship when we found out what was really going on behind the scenes, because we had someone who could actually handle the language well. Personal space, just something to consider when you're in China. Obviously a huge country with so many people. They don't have that much room. Right? Keeping people at arm's length, they'll be closer. And when you first get over there, in many cases you'll be, if you're like me at least, a little bit taken back by it. It's like, whoa, you know. But you get used to it and try and adjust. I sort of go from here to China mode when I go over there now, so that you sort of just flick into it. This one here is very important. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll go through it fairly quickly, right? The issue of a guilt versus a shame culture. Within most Western societies, probably particularly if you're Catholic, you don't have to put your hand up, but in these societies, there's this issue of feeling guilty, right? If you've done the wrong thing. And it doesn't really matter if there's no one there to see what you've done. Internally, you feel guilty, yeah? And of course we have, particularly in the US, this issue of deathbed confessions, where people have had this guilt all their life and just before they die, they actually confess everything. And this is very, very strong law, right? In the US in particular. It's considered the truth, yeah? It doesn't happen in places like China, right? These are people that have a shame culture. And the issue with the shame culture is when someone finds out that you've done the wrong thing, you'll lose face. You'll be shamed, all right? And that's very different to actually internally feeling shame or guilt, or even if no one knows about it, all right? So the game in these societies is, number one, making sure no one finds out about it, all right? Being very, very clever to make sure no one finds out about it, all right? But the other part of the game is that people over there are really nosy. They look into people and situations, trying to catch people out. It's a fundamental of the society. Now, when you understand that, you understand why a lot of things work the way they do in that environment. Very, very different to here. I talk to my Chinese students about the deathbed confessions and so on, and they go, "You're kidding. There's no way we would do that." You know, it's a different, because for them, it's all about status and face. Completely different. Okay, so how do you deal with that? How do you deal with this issue of status and face, you know, when someone's done the wrong thing? Yeah? Well, the issue is you cannot do anything to someone who's going to make someone lose face in front of their peers, right? Because that's where they lose face and that's where they feel the shame. But in private, it's a different story. So if you're going to give someone bad news, make sure that you get them away from everyone else, particularly their peers, where they'll lose face if it gets out, and deal with it very, very subtly and deal with it in private. They'll get the hint, yeah? Try not to be too blunt, yeah? One of the things here that's still really strong, but when I first went over back in the early 90s, was massive, right? This insider-outsider dichotomy. And that is that if you're not part of the in-group, then you're fair game. If you're an outsider, then you're fair game. The way they treat people as insiders, part of this collective society, part of their grouping, is very, very different to the way they treat people as outsiders. And man, that first trip I was just getting ripped off, trying to rip me off, left, right and centre, everywhere, all right? Now, it's not like that anymore. It's a different world, but